Welcome back to Scotties Hobbies. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front brake pads and rotors on a 2013 to 2020 Nissan Pathfinder. In this video, I'm going to let you know all the tools you need, what parts you need, where to apply grease, and the torque specifications when we are doing the reassembly process. If this video does help you out, make sure to comment below with the year, make, and model of the vehicle that it did help you on. And you might be wondering where I get my torque specifications from, and I use this book right here. This is the Motor Guide book, Brake Specifications Guide. It gives me a ton of information on torque specifications and also minimum thickness and maximum diameter when I am machining rotors. In the video, I will also let you know how much the parts cost, and there will be links in the description below to purchase just the pads if you need them, if you're going to resurface the rotors, and a pad and rotor set. You're going to save yourself a ton of money doing this job on your own, and you're also going to not take too long to get the job done if you watch this video and have all of the information in your brain to do this job. It's very quick. So let's get going on this quick BJ for the 2013 to 2020 Nissan Pathfinder. With the vehicle jacked up and properly supported and the wheel off, we're going to want to turn the wheel to the passenger side. In this case, on the passenger side, you want to turn the wheel to the right. On the driver's side, you want to turn it to the left. That just makes it easier to access the brake caliper and assembly, all that good stuff. When you're doing a brake job, it's a lot harder if it's just sitting in there in the wheel well. You got to reach behind everything. So turn the wheel to where the caliper is out, so it's easier to work on. Now that we have that done, we are going to take a look at everything, see what parts we're going to need, see what tools we're going to need to get this job done. Also visually take a look, make sure the CV shaft boots are good, the ball joints are good, the springs, the struts, the shocks, everything are good while you're in there. Just make sure everything is good so you don't have to come back and do another job again or do the job twice in case there's something that you could do right now while you're taking all the brakes apart. Now that we've looked at everything and we've seen what we need, we're going to need a 17 millimeter to get the caliper bolts off of the bracket, and then a 22 millimeter socket to get the caliper bracket off of the knuckle. Those are the two main sockets that we're going to need to get this job done. Let's go ahead and start removing some parts. First, we're going to remove the caliper bolts off of the caliper to bracket. Again, these are going to be 17 millimeter. I'm going to use a 3/8 socket wrench to get these off. Remove those two bolts, set them off to the side, and let's remove the brake caliper. When you remove the caliper, you want to take a look at everything, make sure that the boots, the dust boots on everything on the pistons are good. You don't see any moisture, you don't see any cracks or any abnormal wear that needs to be tended to at this point. On this vehicle, everything looked good. So instead of letting the caliper hang from the brake hose or the brake line, we're going to use a S-hook and actually hang the caliper up from the spring up there. I've never seen it happen to where letting the caliper actually hang on the brake line or hose cause any damage or extra work for yourself, but let's just avoid having that issue. So I like to hang the caliper from a spring if possible. Again, I use an S-hook, but you might use a bungee cord or something like that. Now that we have that caliper hanging up there, we're going to move on to the caliper bracket. We're going to remove the bracket from the knuckle. This here is a 22 millimeter. I had to use a 1/2-inch breaker bar to loosen these bolts up. Later on in the video, when we tighten everything down, we're going to go to proper brake torque specifications to do so, and you'll see that these bolts are tightened up really tight, tighter than the lug nuts. 107 foot-pounds, I believe it was, but we'll go over that later on in the video. Again, a 22 millimeter 1/2-inch breaker bar to get these loosened up. I'm going to use my 3/8 impact, but you could end up using a 1/2-inch socket wrench to remove these all the way, but I just try to speed up the process just a tad bit. We're going to get those taken out, set the bolts off to the side, take the caliper bracket off of the rotor, set that off to the side. We're going to clean this bracket up, put new hardware in it, clean the slider pins, and do all that good stuff. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and remove this rotor and clean up the hub assembly. Remove the rotor, set the rotor off to the side. In this case, we're going to use new rotors, so you don't need to clean up the inside of the rotor on this one because we're not going to reinstall it. But if you're going to resurface this rotor, it'd be a good idea to clean up the inside of the rotor before it gets resurfaced. Part of doing a good brake job isn't just replacing the pads and rotors and torque specifications, all that good stuff. Another point that makes a good brake job is inspecting everything around the brakes. You can see when I removed this rotor, I took a look at everything, just double check everything, and I noticed that the lower ball joint was blown out on this thing. This vehicle was having a slight vibration when braking. It could have been the rotors themselves being warped, but I did notice that this lower ball joint had a little bit of play after further inspection of noticing it was blown out. And we did end up replacing this ball joint about a week later. And after giving the vehicle back after completing the ball joint a week later, the vibration during braking was completely gone. So the actual vibration on this vehicle was actually coming from this lower ball joint being blown out rather than the rotors being a little bit warped. But we went ahead and redid everything, put all new parts on everything. The brake pads were worn out and it was ready to be replaced anyways. Now that we know that there is no other issues that need attending to, we could go ahead and clean off the hub surface. You could use a wire brush like I do here, a Brillo pad. I also have a Steelman hub resurfacing kit. It's just some very abrasive pads that attach to a drill. Cleans them off really good. I'm not sure why I didn't use it in this video actually. And after we get everything cleaned up, grab the new rotor. We're gonna want to apply some anti-seize either to the hub surface or to the rotor surface on the inside. I don't know what makes me choose one or the other, but sometimes I like to put the anti-seize on the inside of the rotor. Just makes it easier to apply. But you're more than welcome, and it will suffice to be just fine if you apply your anti-seize to the hub surface as well. Just make sure it's nice and clean, that you have a nice, smooth, clean surface before you apply the anti-seize and put the rotor on. When you have that anti-seize on there, everything's coated real good, install the rotor onto the hub. I like to use one lug nut to hold the rotor in place. That avoids the rotor from wobbling around or wiggling around during the reassembly process. Just makes everything a lot easier to put back together rather than it just moving around when you're tightening everything up, or even giving yourself the chance to cross thread something because something just wasn't fitting properly because that rotor was a little bit cockeyed. Now that we have the rotor on there held on with the lug nut, let's take some attention to the brake caliper bracket. Remove the brake pads. Make sure you take into consideration of where, or take note of where the wear indicator was placed on the brake pads when you remove the brake pads from the brake caliper bracket. And usually the wear indicator, or the squeaker, or whatever you want to call it, is located on the leading edge of the inboard pad. So that's a good rule of thumb to know where it should be located. Remove the brake pads, remove the old hardware, and we're going to clean up these sliders. These sliders were actually pretty seized inside there. They weren't moving freely. So I went ahead, we removed the sliders, and I'm cleaning these ones out really good. I don't always clean the sliders out like I do in this video, but this one needed some extra attention. And this car is, I want to make sure that it's good. It's precious cargo is being stored or transported in this vehicle. So I took a little wire brush and I connected it to my drill, used some WD-40 and cleaned these slider pin slots or holes out really good. Dried them out, and then applied the brake caliper grease to these. When you apply the grease to these slider pins, you don't want to use too much grease. Just a thin layer of grease works out pretty good. In this video, I might have used maybe a tad bit too much grease, but as long as you don't have this huge, thick blob of grease on there, you're going to be fine. A little bit of grease goes a very long way when it comes to brakes. So again, lube up these slider pins really good, not too much grease. Get them installed into the caliper bracket, make sure they move freely in and out, and let's get ready to install the new hardware. Before we install new hardware onto the brake caliper bracket, we want to clean up the brake caliper bracket really good. Use a wire brush or a wire wheel if you have one, but make sure you get all the dirt, the grime, the rust, everything that's on the brake caliper bracket built up under the hardware kit. You want to make sure that's all completely cleaned up. You might also want to apply a little bit of anti-seize between the anti-squeal shims and the bracket itself. That'll cause some sound dampening and also make sure that they don't get stuck to the caliper bracket, but don't use too much anti-seize in this case. You don't want the anti-seize to get onto the rotor or the other braking components, and you never want to put anti-seize on the actual sliders where the pads meet the sliders. That will cause your pads to not move properly. We're going to get the new hardware kit in, and according to manufacturer specifications, they would like you to install or put grease on the inside of the sliders where the ear of the pads will meet the anti-squeal shims. They recommend it, so I like to do as the manufacturer recommends. I don't always put grease on the sliders. You might run into an issue or an opinion to where when you have grease on the sliders where the ears meet the pads, or the ears of the pads meet the sliders, that might cause dirt and grime to build up right there and cause the pads to actually not work properly. But I think as long as the manufacturer recommends it and you're using the proper grease, follow manufacturer recommended specifications or recommendations when doing a brake job. Now that the caliper bracket is all cleaned up, we got our new hardware in there, and it's ready to be reinstalled. Let's go ahead and put the caliper bracket over the rotor onto the knuckle, and we're going to grab our 22mm bolts and put them through the knuckle into the caliper bracket. These bolts are going to be tightened down to 107 foot-pounds. I use a 1/2 inch torque wrench to tighten these ones up. I like the clicking style torque wrenches more than the digital ones, but whatever works for you, it'll work. 107 foot-pounds on these 22 millimeter bolts from the knuckle to the caliper bracket. After we get this bracket properly torqued down, we're going to want to apply a little bit of grease to the ears of the brake pads, and that's due to manufacturer recommendations when doing the assembly process, and not my opinion, but following their recommendations. Get a little bit of grease on those ears, and your wear indicator is going to be placed on the inboard pad on the top. That is the leading edge of the inboard brake pad on this vehicle. So make sure you install the pads to where the wear indicator is on the inside pad on the top, which is the leading edge. Get both of your brake pads installed into the brake caliper bracket into the silencers. These brake pads were actually a little bit rough to get installed into the caliper bracket. On each side there was these little springs that would hold the pad into the center or keep it centered in the brake caliper bracket. I had to use a pair of pliers and squeeze those springs a little bit to get it to go inside of the brake caliper bracket. If you do this, don't squeeze too much to where you cause that springing action not to be working anymore or cause no more spring action. I just squeeze the spring a little bit just to get them installed into the brake caliper bracket, slide them into place, and everything seemed to work just fine. This vehicle has been on the road for a few months now and we have not had any problems with the braking, so tightening or squeezing these springs to get them installed, just as long as you don't do it too much, doesn't seem to be any type of issue. Now before we can install the caliper over the pads onto the bracket, we're going to have to compress the pistons back into the caliper. First, we need to go up to the brake fluid reservoir and loosen that cap. Make it so that if you push so much fluid into the reservoir, it doesn't blow any seals. So just loosen that cap, and if there is too much fluid, it'll just overflow and escape onto the ground instead of blowing out any seals or gaskets or anything like that. Again, this might not actually happen, and I've never seen pushing the pistons back into the caliper cause any seals to blow out, but again, better safe than sorry. Now with that reservoir off, we're going to go grab the caliper that was hanging up there on the spring, grab a old brake pad and our brake caliper compressor, and we're going to push these pistons all the way back into the caliper itself. When you are doing this brake job, or when you're doing this brake job, if you need any of the tools that are shown in this video, make sure you look for links in the description below to purchase those tools and parts, such as this brake caliper compression tool. When you are pushing the pistons back into the caliper, make sure you take note of everything. Make sure that you don't see any leaking, you don't see anything going in crooked. You want everything to go in nice and smooth. You don't want any extra effort to push any of this in. Everything should go back together or be pushed in very, very easy. It might take a little bit of muscle, but not to where you're like, why isn't this going in? It should just go in. It should slide in fairly easy. Once you get the pistons pushed all the way into the caliper, you're ready to reinstall the caliper over the brake pads. At this time, you might choose to put some grease on the back side of the brake pads on the silencer shims where the caliper is going to meet the brake pads. That might cause a little bit of sound dampening down the road, but it's not required because you do have the silencer shims on these brake pads already. And if you use the Powerstop brake pads that you'll find links in the description below, these brake pads, I've never had problems with them. And the silencers, the shims on the back of these pads are really good and seem to absorb sound over time. I've never had any issues with these brake pads. Now we're ready to get the caliper put back over the brake pads onto the bracket. We are going to do so and then grab the 17 millimeter bolts that will fasten the caliper onto the bracket. These bolts, 17 millimeters, we're going to start them with our fingers and then use a 3/8 torque wrench to tighten these down to 34 foot-pounds. You might need to use a crescent wrench or open-end wrench to hold the slider pins from sliding or spinning when you are tightening these bolts down. But again, 17 millimeter bolts tightened down to 34 foot-pounds. After you get these tightened up, you want to go up to the vehicle or up to the driver's seat of the vehicle, press on the brake pad until you get a nice, stiff, firm brake pad. After you do so, go back to the brakes, make sure there's no leaking, there's no fluid coming out, it all looks good. And then go up to the fluid reservoir and make sure that you're topped off to where you're at the full line. If you need fluid, top it off at this time. If it is overfull a little bit, I wouldn't worry too much, but if you're at the brim, you might want to use like a Mighty Vac or a vacuum or something like that and suck some of the fluid out to where you are at the full line. Now you think you might be all done, but there is one more very important step to this brake job that we have not done yet, and that is tightening up the lug nuts to the proper torque specification as well. On this vehicle, these lug nuts are tightened up to 83 foot-pounds. You want to tighten up your lug nuts in a star pattern, not in a circle pattern. It's important to make sure that the wheel is pushed up firmly, flush, up against the rotor, the wheel hub, all that. You don't want to cause any vibration or excessive brake wear due to the wheel not being put on straight or firmly up against the rotor and the hub. After you do that, you're all said and done. You also might want to make sure that you torque the wheels while you're on the ground. It makes it a lot easier. This is an all-wheel drive vehicle, so you could torque it while it's in the air. But if you tighten up the lug nuts snug tight and then drop it on the ground and then torque them down, you're more than fine. And that's the easiest way to do the lug nut torque specification on any vehicle. Now, if this video helped you out, make sure to comment below with the year, make, and model of the vehicle that did help you on. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Check out the video library for a ton of other helpful DIY videos on maintaining your vehicle. Tell everybody about Scotties Hobbies, please. And I will see you guys in the next hopefully helpful video. Thanks for checking out Scotties Hobbies.